The place, the Murray Abbey near Zurich, Switzerland. The date, November 10, the eve of St. Martin's Day in the year 1082. This is likely the earliest existing record of the name Derstine. The monks of Murray Monastery had good reason to be celebrating that St. Martin's Eve in 1082. For arriving was Werner of Habsburg, from the Habsburg family that would eventually go on to rule much of Europe. At this time, Werner was Count of Habsburg Castle and son of the nobleman who had founded the monastery 55 years earlier. He was coming to grant new lands to the abbey. Because of the importance of this occasion in the history of the monastery, the monks kept careful record in Latin of the nobility in attendance, even mentioning family relationships. One of the names listed was Rudolphus Comes de Dierstein, Rudolph, Count of Thierstein. In this early Latin document, the name was spelled with a D. Over the next couple centuries, the name would more commonly be spelled with a T, but eventually the majority of descendants in Switzerland would spell it with a TH. The Rudolph mentioned here is believed to be descended from local leaders in the Frick Valley, or Fricktal, a region bordered by the Rhine River and Jura Mountains, south of the town of Rheinfelden. This was the period when that region had weak imperial rule from the Holy Roman Empire, which allowed local counts to arise and establish bases of power. To do so, the first task of a count in a region is to select a defensible location to build a castle or fortress. This count in the Fricktal region chose a mountain known locally as Tierberg, or perhaps Dierberg. Berg in German means mountain. Tier today means animal, but at the time the word was used by hunters specifically to mean a doe or female European red deer. Why was the mountain called Tierberg? Swiss historian Martin Berman attributed it to the fact that the forests that blanketed the mountains were rich hunting grounds. The ruins of that castle can still be seen today. The castle built on Tierberg they called Thierstein. Stein, meaning stone, is a good solid word used in the names of many European castles. As ruler of that castle, Rudolf was known as Rudolf von Thierstein. In the coat of arms of the Thierstein noble family, we see the red doe against a yellow background, standing on three ridges that form the mountain upon which the fortress was built. The full family crest includes a rack of antlers surrounding a nobleman or woman. Later versions of the family crest added roses to the points of the antlers. The Thierstein noble family continued on for 471 years and 15 generations. During that time, their territories waxed and waned as marriages and alliances added lands and other family lines ended due to deaths without a male heir. Much of northwestern Switzerland was at one time or another ruled by the Thierstein family, and a total of 7 castles or castle ruins in Switzerland and France that were once owned by the House of Thierstein can still be seen today. The final castle in the Thierstein line, in Colmar in the Alsace region of France, was the grandest of them all, Haut Koenigsbourg, which means literally the High King's Castle. Swiss historian August Burckhardt tells of Oswald I. Oswald gained a position with the Habsburg Empire as a commander of troops and governor in the Alsace region of France. Meanwhile, Haut Koenigsbourg had been partially burned down because it had become the headquarters of rogue knights who were terrorizing the population. Habsburg Emperor Frederick III appointed Oswald and his brother to repair the castle and bring it back to its former glory. Oswald I died in 1487, but his two sons, Oswald II and Heinrich, were failing to produce heirs. Neither Oswald II nor Heinrich had legitimate children who survived to adulthood to carry on the noble line. With Oswald II's passing in 1514 and Heinrich's passing in 1519, the noble house of Thierstein had come to an end. And yet, in the neighboring canton of Bern, there continued to be families of people with the last name Thierstein. One cluster lived just along the edge of the River Valley, or the Emmental, particularly around the villages of Großhochstetten and Beauville. Another cluster was centered around the city of Thun in the Bernese Oberland, or the Highlands as you get into the Swiss Alps. In his 1932 article on the fall of the House of Thierstein, August Burckhardt has notes to suggest a connection between the Counts von Thierstein and the Thiersteins of the Emmental. According to Burckhardt, although there were no legitimate heirs in the Thierstein line, there were a few children of one Count Thierstein or another that were not by marriage. He lists a couple of possible individuals that they could be descended from. However, very recent genealogical research, made easier by the digitization of old records, has found that there were Thiersteins living in the region as early as the 1350s, before the births of these individuals identified by Burckhardt. Does this mean that they are descended from unknown branches of earlier generations of the Thierstein noble family? Or does it suggest they are descended from an ordinary citizen who adopted the name? We still can't say conclusively. Those who are interested in knowing more about the noble house of Thierstein and documentary evidence about the earliest generations of Thiersteins in the canton of Bern should click on the link at the end of this video for a supplemental video with Swiss historian Nico Piazzalonga. Returning to the Emmental in the 16th century, we see a new consequential development. On January 10, 1535, there is a record that a person with the last name Thierstein was among a group of 19 individuals with names like Blum, Berkey, and Baumann. These individuals were detained and had to appear before authorities because they were caught at a meeting from a movement that would shape the fate of the Thierstein-Derstine family in the centuries to come. Throughout human history, religious faith has been a source of both comfort and community, but it has also been a source of control where government leaders have cynically used religious faith of the people to support their claim to power. At the same time, certain religious groups have turned to the power of civil authority to suppress their critics and competing ideas by force. In the Middle Ages, throughout most of Western Europe, the Catholic Church, combined with the power of the Holy Roman Empire, held dominance. Yet in 1517, new modes of communication had paved the path for societal transformation when Martin Luther took the dangerous move of posting 95 theses, or criticisms of the Catholic Church, an act that sparked the Protestant Reformation in Germany. One place that his ideas were having an effect was in Zurich, Switzerland. Mennonite historian John Ruth explains.
In Switzerland, there was a man named Ulrich Zwingli, who was a farm boy from eastern Switzerland, and basically he was a chaplain for the Swiss. Had the best soldiers. Everybody wanted to hire them, and he was a chaplain for them. And there was a very bloody defeat. He said, "Enough of this. We're Christians. What are we doing this? We're Christians fighting Christians." And anyway, the business class of the city of Zurich in northern Switzerland heard about him, and they invited him up to the town of Zurich, and he began preaching. And he was a minor genius. He could play any musical instrument. He knew languages. He had studied under Erasmus, and he began preaching with a new spirit in Zurich. A town of 7,000 in Zurich. Has a wall around it with about 13 towers and 7 gates and all, a typical late medieval city. And he's in the big church. It's called the Grossmünster. That's the German word for big church. And he, instead of turning back toward the crucifix and saying, Hoc est corpus meum, this is my body. He turns toward the congregation. He opens the Greek New Testament, which he knows cold, and he starts with Matthew, and he says, now whatever I get to, I'm going to preach. Well, within 4 chapters, you're in the Bergpredigt, which the Sermon on the Mount. Well, I mean, it was a sensation. They said, let's go for it. This is not church tradition. Mm-hmm. Now, among his followers, the hangers-on, was a younger group of guys that got together and talked and knew their Hebrew and their Greek. And one guy in particular was Conrad Grebel. I think I've got a picture of him here my son drew there, based on a picture from Zurich. Anyway, they got together. So essentially, this younger group, they began to break with the older patterns. They began to question what was the Mass about? Why don't you eat meat on certain days and all those things? And they even said, what's this business of baptizing babies that don't know what's going on?
Zwingli and his followers were weighing practices and teachings of the church against what they saw in the Bible. And where the two differed, they threw out the tradition in favor of what they saw in Scripture. But Zwingli also recognized the existing power structure. If he wanted to have freedom to grow his movement, he needed to ally himself with the town council, and that would involve certain theological compromises with the council.
A younger group pretty soon began to be dissatisfied with Zwingli, because they said, you've turned us on to the Word, and these are our ideas. He said, we got to keep on baptizing babies because you can only go as fast as the town council will let you go. And basically this younger group says, well, who's in charge here? Are we going to reform the church? Who are we looking to? What works? So essentially, they wouldn't baptize their babies, and then came the crunch. And the Zwingli leagued with the town council, said, you either do that or you're in trouble.
The group led by Conrad Grebel were pushing for believers' baptism. They saw baptism as a symbol of a voluntary break with an old way of life and commitment to a new faith rather than merely a step that happened to all citizens in infancy. Zwingli and this group had a couple public debates, each trying to win the other over to their thinking. But after a second one, Zwingli cut it off. On January 23rd, 1525, the town council expelled the group from the church and told them to leave Zurich or be arrested. That night, the group gathered in the home of one of the original 3 leaders, Felix Manz. George H. Williams, in his book The Radical Reformation, quotes how one of the other leaders, George Blaurock, remembers that night. It came to pass that they were together until fear began to come over them. Yea, they were oppressed in their hearts. Thereupon they began to bow their knees to the Most High God in heaven, and called upon him as the knower of hearts, implored him to enable them to do his divine will and to manifest his mercy towards them. For flesh and blood and human forwardness did not drive them, since they well knew what they would have to bear and suffer on account of it. After the prayer, George Blaurock arose and asked Conrad to baptize him, for the sake of God, with the true Christian baptism, upon his faith and knowledge. And when he knelt down, Conrad baptized him. After that was done, the others similarly desired George to baptize them, which he also did upon their request.
Oh, sinners, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sinners, let's go down in the river too.
Although the group simply called themselves Christians or brothers, other names began to be assigned them.
When they didn't baptize children, when they baptized adults, they were a heretical term was applied to them. You are rebaptizers, Anabaptist in Greek. I mean, that's the same in German. It's Wiedertäufer, rebaptized. They said, we're not rebaptizing. We don't call that baptism what you did to a baby anyway. We're just getting baptized.
Yeah.
Okay, well then you're Täufer, you're Baptists, you are heretics. and basically you are you're treasonous to society. So a minority group grew, and had that not happened, had that line not been crossed, I would have never been born, and never would have been such a people.
Yet baptism was just the outward symbol of the change in perspective and way of life that this group was called to. They took very literally the words of Jesus when he said,
"You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you."
In obedience to these words, they made a commitment to return good for evil in their personal life and not be compelled to bear the sword by government. The persecution that they knew would come arrived within a month of their baptism. Multiple times they were imprisoned, but each time they went right back to preaching. Those who were expelled from the territory only spread the movement further throughout Zurich, Basel, Bern, Germany, and Austria. Within 2 years, the punishment increased from imprisonment and banishment to torture and public execution, beginning with Felix Manz. The execution of Manz took place on the day he was condemned, 5th of January, 1527. He went to his death with courage. As he walked from the fish market to the river, he praised God, while his mother and brother waited along the way to encourage him to remain steadfast. He was trussed with a stick thrust between his roped, doubled-up legs and arms, and as he was being drawn into the icy water, he sang, "In manus tuos, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." Into thy hands I commit my spirit. With this understanding of the Anabaptist movement, we move from the canton of Zurich to the canton of Bern, where in 1535 a man or woman named Thierstein was among a group of 19 individuals from the canton of Bern who were detained after they were caught attending an Anabaptist meeting. We don't know how closely these Thiersteins were related to the ancestors of the Diersteins who had come to Pennsylvania. There are challenges in tracing the lineage of Swiss Anabaptists, or even determining whether ancestors were Anabaptists. The danger of imprisonment, exile, and even death meant that Anabaptists practiced their faith with great secrecy, avoiding keeping any church records that would indicate who the leaders or members were. This is one of several challenges for genealogists in determining who was Anabaptist. Another is that in an age before birth certificates, marriage and baptismal records in the state Reformed Church parishes were referred to by the town councils to keep track of their populations for tax and other purposes. By threat, they compelled many Anabaptists to allow their infants to be baptized and to have their marriages performed in Reformed churches. These Swiss baptismal records are listed online by Reformed Church parish going back to the 1550s. Bruce Vosnacht is a retired genealogist with experience reading the old scripts found in these parish records. With the aid of a database he built up, he volunteered his time with this project, tracing the roots of the Dierstein family. He traced the family back to Steffensburg near Thun in the Bernese Highlands. There, on February 6 of 1558, an infant named Ulrich Dierstein was baptized. His father was also named Ulrich Dierstein. No mother is listed as being present. Young Ulrich Derstine was likely born into an Anabaptist family. The movement was very active in Steffensburg, and 1558 was still a time when Anabaptists were being imprisoned and in some cases killed for their faith. Unrepentant Anabaptists from the region were locked at Thun Castle. As the century progressed, some in the faith moved to the region with the greatest number of Anabaptists, the Emmental. The Emmental, a rural agricultural community known for dairy farms and the famous Emmental cheese, is perhaps the region of Switzerland where the Anabaptist movement had its deepest roots in the community. The Reverend Philipp Schmuki is the recently retired pastor of Alttäufergemeinde Emmental in Langnau, which started as a house church and claims the honor of being the longest continuously active Mennonite church in the world. In that role, from time to time, he has greeted Mennonite guests from North America and talked to them about their Anabaptist heritage. He was able to provide insights into what life was like for these Anabaptists.
The Emmental is one long valley with many side valleys, and those side valleys have valleys again, some of them up to 12 side valleys. So the church here in Langnau started during the Reformation time. That was around 1520, 1524. We're not exactly sure when those different home Bible studies started. Those home Bible studies of the Anabaptists were usually in farmhouses, out where the haystack was, or in their living room, or out in a forest, or maybe in a cave, or down in a valley where not everybody could see them. What did they do in their worship service?
Yes.
We do not know exactly, because the Anabaptists were not allowed to keep any records. They didn't want to keep any records, so nobody could find out what they did. But we assume and know from Reformed Church history books that there was maybe a handful of people who sat around a table where they also used to eat, or they were 20 or more people in the living room. Somewhere on the farm, they would read scriptures, or at least one would read the scripture. They tried to explain it. They definitely did pray together. This gave support to them as a family.
At some point, young Ulrich Dierstein and his father did likewise, moving to the town of Signau. On the northwest side of town, there was a large estate or farm that was referred to simply as the Hof. Hof was owned by two men, Tobias Neukommit and Ulrich Haldeman. Ulrich Haldeman was an Anabaptist, and before 1589, young Ulrich Dierstein would marry his daughter, Catherine, and would be hired as a caretaker or manager of the Hof. Thus, many of the records about the young Uli Dierstein add the phrase im Hof to the end of his name. The late 1580s and 1590s were a great time for Ulrich and Catherine to be starting their life as a young married couple. The good news for Anabaptists was that they were entering a window of relative tolerance for Anabaptists in the Emmental. The last public execution of an Anabaptist in Bern happened in 1571, and in 1581 the Bernese council made it official, saying they would not execute. There were still severe punishments on the books, but in the next few decades it appears that there was not the will among local officials in the Emmental to torture and imprison their neighbors. With the threat of imprisonment off the table, Uli Dierstein was able to be prosperous and play a prominent role in the civic life of his community. In at least two records, he appears as the legal guardian for a widow or an orphan, representing them in their legal proceedings. In one case, he helps a widow to collect money owed to her. In another case, he appears in court as the guardian of a young man who is trying to secure a loan. Despite the opportunity for Anabaptists to prosper, this did not mean that they were treated equally with other citizens. There's a book of records from Signal preserved in the Bern archives of taxes and fines charged to Anabaptists, and several records in this register refer to taxes paid by Uli Dierstein. Some of his sons and in-laws are also listed in the book. Several members of this community also have fines for running certain kinds of businesses, such as inns, without a license. Perhaps there was an effort to exclude Anabaptists from these businesses, and if they did not comply, they were fined. The only record we see of Ulrich Sr. is from 1590, when he was fined for selling wine without the proper permit. To deal with these sudden expenses, you often see members of Signal Anabaptist community supporting each other by acting as guarantors or co-signers of loans. Diersteins, Krabels, Haldemans, Zaugs, Neuschwanders, and Rugzeggers helping each other out. However, in doing so, sometimes the co-signers were stuck with the debt burden if the borrower was unable to pay. Today, half a mile up the road from Hof, where a number of these Anabaptists lived, we find a restaurant called Restaurant Kreuz, or the Cross Restaurant. From an old postcard, we see the original name of this building was Wirtschaft zum Kreuz, or the Inn at the Cross. Apparently, it was this building referred to in a 1610 document when Uli Derstine guaranteed a loan for his neighbor, Tobias Neukommen, who is the innkeeper for an inn named At the Cross. 2 years later, Tobias borrowed more money, this time directly from Uli Derstine, putting up property as collateral. By 1615, Uli Derstine is referred to in tax documents as an innkeeper, and then later that same year he sells the inn, now called At the White Cross, to the landvogt of Signal, which would be the highest local official. A few years later, in 1621, Uli Derstine was himself granted an official position in the local government. One record refers to him as the Honorable Ulrich Thierstein in the Hof, and another refers to him as the Weibel or Weibel of Signal. Perhaps the closest comparison to this position today would be a court bailiff or a marshal that carries out court business. Uli and Catherine would go on to have 6 children who would survive to adulthood: Annie, Andres, Nicholas, Christina, Hans, and Barbara. Uli and Catherine died sometime before their youngest daughter, Barbara's, wedding in 1630. Uli Dierstein's son, Andres, would inherit the Hof. Andreas was born before February 13, 1592. January 11, 1610, close to his 18th birthday, he married Anna Eichelberger. Andreas and Anna had 3 children, Katharina, Ulrich, and Nicholas. We know Andreas followed his father's Anabaptist faith, for in 1535 his name appears in that register of Anabaptist fines and taxes. On his property at the Hof, he needed to pay an annual tax of £6 15 shillings, 2 bushels 10 measures of spelt, 10 measures of oats, 1 old and 1 young hen, and 10 eggs. But within a few decades, the family would need to pay a much higher price for their faith. Delbert Gratz writes, "By 1640, it appears that in the Emmental there was a considerable number of Anabaptists. Each village had a group. On January 25, a meeting to review the Anabaptist situation was to be held. The old mandates were again put into effect, and strict orders were given to the local authorities to stop looking through their fingers, and with God's help to completely outroot this sect." Philipp Schmuki describes what life would have been like for Anabaptists during this age.
The local government got the chasers who chased the Anabaptists. When they had a meeting somewhere, they would go and find out where is the meeting, show up at their house and took the men away. When the persecutors came up the valley, then a farmer saw them coming. So he made the sound of a bird with a certain speed, a certain tune, so the neighbors could hear that sound and would know, whoops, we're warned, let's move away, disperse into the forest or into a hiding they had prepared into their farmhouse. So the neighbors would warn them at times when they were on good terms.
The neighbors who helped out were often referred to as Alttäufer, or half-Anabaptists.
And when they found out that they were worshipping at some house or so, very often the head of the household, the father of the farm, got taken away, imprisoned in Drachselwald or maybe even in Bern, or sent to a neighboring country, Germany, the Pfalz, or the Netherlands. and many of them died in prison. Some were deported to the Pfalz or to the Netherlands, and then they returned illegally to Switzerland to their families. They found their farms dilapidated, their children and wife starving, but they couldn't be seen in public.
The Castle Troxelwald was the seat of government in the Emmental, and its tower contained a dungeon.
The Castle of Troxelwald was the first place the Anabaptists got brought to be imprisoned. But that's where they were imprisoned, and many Anabaptists died in those cells. They were cold, there was no heating, the climate was much colder than today. They had no warm clothing, no heating system, not enough food, just water and bread or maybe a bit of milk. That was very hard. Many Anabaptists died in those prisons.
In houses where Anabaptist worshippers gathered to meet, or where a member of the family had secretly returned from exile, hiding places were sometimes built to evade the Anabaptist catchers sent from Bern.
We know of several farmhouses in this area that still exist. They used to have those hiding places, but they, by renovation, they got taken away, and they use that area now. There's only one farmhouse left in the valley of Trueb, where we still can go and see how they got into that hiding place. There was about room for 3 men or so, and maybe a boy or two. That was next to the haystack in the farmhouse. Like in Switzerland, the living house, the barn, the haystack, that's all under one roof. That's all together. So you go around the living house near to the haystack where they had the corn and whatever else a farmer keeps. Next to the haystack, they had a double flooring. So the farmer, when he knew they were coming, he could go to that double flooring, jump on the floor, the door would open, he could go down with 2 or 3 more, and then from underneath, he would put the door up again, and then put a wooden slat underneath, and the family would put the hay on top, and whenever they came to look for them, they could come, they would take the hay fork, stab into the hay to see if they're in there. They couldn't find them and had no idea where they would be hiding. So eventually, the searchers for the Anabaptists got a little bit smart, and they said, as soon as new snow falls, we go after them. Then we see the footprints where they run to. So they could run after them into the forest, or they could see the footprint coming out of the farmhouse, running around the house, going through the door that leads to the haystack. The pastors of the Reformed Church, they reacted differently to the Anabaptist movement. They weren't all in unity. Some pastors in the Reformed Church, they actually were involved in the persecution very much. They sent their own people out to go and search for them, or they knew of them. So they went to them by day or by night and brought them by foot to Troxelwald or to Bern. To Bern would be a 3 to 6 days journey, depends on the route they would take. There was one pastor who actually wrote a pamphlet. I have nothing bad or nothing wrong to say about the Anabaptists. They're all very well disposed. I cannot preach against them, because if everybody would live like them, we would have a better society. So the government in Bern got upset with that pastor and similar pastors, and they made it very simple and said, okay, we know there, let's say, 4 Anabaptists in your town or in your valley. So you send us 4 well-known persons of your town. We keep them imprisoned till you bring us those 4 Anabaptists. And those 4 well-known persons will be free to come back. So they forced the hand of the Reformed pastors who knew the public the best.
As a reminder to stay strong in the faith, these Anabaptists sang songs from the Ausbund, a hymnal filled with songs written by and telling the story of those previous generations who had been killed for their faith. Many of these songs are still sung today in the Amish church. But in 1671, the government turned to a new threat that many viewed as worse than death: to be sold to Venice to be a galley slave, to live their lives as an oarsman in the hull of a ship. That was the year that the dam burst, and the Anabaptists began to leave Bern in large numbers. It was in this time of persecution that Nicholas and Margaret Dierstein would have 5 children: Andreas, Barbly, Ulrich, Nicholas, and Samuel. Not all of these children would remain at home in Switzerland. They would leave property built up over centuries and become refugees with only what they could carry. In the next video, we will follow Samuel and other Diersteins who left Switzerland and their descendants who came to America. Take a moment to subscribe to the channel to follow their story.